All right, so we got something really cool to talk about today. What we're going to do in this next hour, hour and 20 minutes or so is, in a nutshell, we're going to talk about how life, we've already talked about how we think life began on Earth. And remember that it involves an awful lot of suppositions on our part. It's very difficult to know exactly what was going on back then, but we can mimic the kinds of conditions. And with some of that research that I told you those guys were doing with protocells, or those researchers were doing with protocells, brings up some interesting questions about how we could have got this abiotic formation of packaging, these phospholipids, and then how if you add just a few little simple enzymes, and we think initially those were RNA that were the enzymes, and how you can get some very basic metabolic reactions out of that. So that's the biogenesis part, and I just kind of briefly went over some of the major steps that we believe should have happened. But what we're going to move on to now is talk about, once life began, what were the changes on Earth that led to all the diversity that we see today. Now, I know this is probably a moot point, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What caused all these evolutionary changes that we see throughout the last, you look on this little scale here, about 3.8 billion years? What caused all these organisms what caused this diversity? What caused all these changes? Yeah, Sean's got it, right? It's always about the environment. And I know, changes in the environment. I know I've said that a million times, but that's so important that you understand that organisms don't evolve unless there's some reason for them to adapt. You have to. That's right, Alexis. Absolutely. Because I get questions like that from people sometimes. Well, why don't these organisms evolve? Well, there's no reason to evolve unless you have to adapt to your environment. Evolution is not something that is goal-oriented. It's not something that has an end result. It's not something that follows a path. It basically is sort of like, I guess it follows a path. It's kind of a wandering path back and forth depending on how the environment changes. So as we go through this material today, we're going to talk about some really just widespread environmental changes that occurred on Earth that led to the diversity we see today. But we're going to go back and we're going to start at the very beginning at about 3.8 billion years ago. This was the last slide that you guys saw the other day. Now remember, we have no clear fossils before this time, but that does not mean life wasn't around. Fossilization is not a given process. In other words, not every organism that dies becomes a fossil. I don't remember if I sent it to you all in the Twitter feed, but there was an interesting article came out the other day. Yeah, absolutely. About could it be possible to predict evolution in an organism? Malia, only if, what Alexis says, you can make an assumption, but no real prediction because we don't know what the environment is going to do. If we can sense some idea of the environment changing through time, we might be able to make some predictions, but certainly the organism itself couldn't make any predictions about the environment. Remember, it really just comes down to chance if you happen to be born with that advantageous variation or not, right? Yeah. I'll show you at the end when we talk about horses and the evolution of horses, Aaliyah. We'll come back to this idea of evolution having a path. That might help you out there. So was there life before 3.8 billion years ago? Again, we don't really know. If it was before then, it probably wasn't a lot before then, simply because we know the conditions on Earth and the way they were very difficult for early life. For example, back during that time, about 3.8 billion years ago, the new Earth was a really violent place. The solar system, goodness gracious, I forgot what it was called. The solar system was basically a pinball gallery, they say. This was the time when the planets were forming, when the solar system was forming, and there was a lot of leftover rocks that were floating around, a lot of asteroids and meteors and meteorites, and things were bouncing off each other and smacking at each other. And there even is some research to indicate that Jupiter, that big huge gas planet that we have in our solar system, formed closer into the sun and then migrated out to where it is today, and meanwhile just ripped things apart as it was making its way out to its orbit that it is today. So a lot different, as we talked about the other day, planet, solar system than it was now. So there was a lot of meteor bombardment, a lot of asteroids, and of course that bombardment released a lot of energy. You get these massive amounts of mass. You have these large amounts of mass of rocks plowing into each other, releasing just explosive amounts of energy. And with all that energy, there was There was no water. The heat from the bombardment of all these pinball things flying around just evaporated it. And we know that water is important for life as we have it on Earth. So our ideas of geology inform us about when some of the early when some early organisms may have evolved, because we kind of know what the Earth was like 3.8 or so billion years ago. Doesn't seem like a place that was very conducive for life as we know it. Billions of years ago. MYA is millions of years ago. BYA, billions of years ago. Yeah. Well, everything starts to settle down around about this time, 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago. The pinball gallery begins to settle down a little bit. The asteroid belt that's out past Mars. You know, we have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then there's a belt before you get out to Jupiter of a bunch of rocks. The asteroid belt. Those are leftover pieces of material that didn't make its way into a planet. As a matter of fact, when I was telling you about the Jupiter thing, what I read suggested that if you look at the planets, Mercury's very small, Venus is a little bigger, Earth is a little bigger than that. Those are the rocky planets, the inside planets. Remember, the Jupiter and Saturn are gaseous planets. And then Mars, based on looking at the size progression, should be bigger than it is, but it's actually smaller than Earth. That Jupiter thing I was telling you about, when Jupiter actually migrated out to the orbit where it is now, it might have actually taken, gravitationally speaking, and ripped away a lot of that rock material out that would have made Mars, and that's what eventually made the asteroid belt. Now, we don't get hit by asteroids very often anymore now, do we? I mean, okay, if you think, well, asteroid, meteor, meteorite, it just depends on where they are. A meteor, it's something that enters the Earth's atmosphere, and then a meteorite is actually when it's a meteorite when it actually makes its way to the surface of the Earth, if I remember right or not. But anyway, there's space rock out there floating around, and we don't get a whole lot of those. Yeah, just very small ones at this point. We certainly don't get those Earth-shattering ones that we're going to talk about today when we talk about some of the evolution events or some of the extinction events that happened on Earth. A couple of the extinction events, one very notable one, was brought about by simply just an asteroid. I've heard of maybe one case of a dog getting hit by one and dying. Yeah. There's an old black and white photo of a woman. I think she's the only. Hi, Brandon. How are you? I think she's the only case of a human being documented to be hit by a meteorite. Yeah, there's a picture of her laying in bed in the hospital. She's got this huge bruise on her side where apparently the meteorite hit you. I can't imagine what that would be like, right? Yeah. Can you imagine you kind of standing outside and out of thin air, basically, this rock comes down and hits you. It must have been quite a surprise to her, but I think that's the only documented human, what do you want to call it, contact with an extraplanetary object like that. Anyway, so as the Earth begins to cool down, as this bombardment begins to end, we get this formation of liquid water. And again, very important. I've talked to you before about my fascination with astrobiology, right? And so if it's got water, there's a good chance it's got life. There's a chance. I wouldn't say good. There's a chance it's got life, at least life as we know it. So that's why we get all excited when we see that out on other planets. So as we move out from 8.8 billion years ago, a little bit later down the road, about, say, 300 million years ago, so at about 3.5 billion years, we have evidence in the geological record that we start to see the beginning of life on Earth. And initially, it's going to be the prokaryotes. Those relatively, I don't know what you'll call them, relatively simple kind of organisms. Maybe that's not the best way to refer to them as simple. They might not think they're simple. But compared to some of the complexity of the other critters we see on the planet, we can, feel comfortable in arguing that prokaryotes are on the relatively simple end of the spectrum. But that doesn't mean that they weren't hardy. That doesn't mean they weren't tough. Remember, the early Earth was a really rough place, right? So at about 3.5 billion years ago, when these prokaryotes first came first arose on the planet, it was not a very nice place. And we're going to talk in chapter 27 about prokaryotes. We'll talk a little bit more about this domain archaea of the prokaryotes. The Archean prokaryotes are sometimes known as the extremophiles. It's like the X Games of biology, man. They can live, that's not how you spell extremophiles, but you get the idea. They can live in all kinds of radical conditions. They can live in acids that are almost near zero in pH. I mean, you can't get stronger than a zero pH acid. They can live out in the radiation of space. These organisms can survive conditions on Earth that, that most critters don't. Now, if you think about it, then it might make sense. Oh, don't give me water bears, man. Don't get me started on water bears. We can talk about water bears, Alexis, when we actually get into animals. Those are not prokaryotes, but those are animals. But Alexis brings up a really good point. Water bears, look them up online. Water bears or tardigrades. Tardigrade, they're slow walkers. Tardigrade, to walk slowly. Tardigrades are some of the most bizarre critters in the world out there. They are animals that can survive these really dramatic conditions. Like Alexis says, or asked there about the water bears. Yeah, they brought water bears out into space. Yeah, they brought water bears out into space and exposed them to the radiation and the vacuum and the dehydration of space. And while many of them died, not all of them. And this was after 2 weeks of exposure to the vacuum of space. My God. Now, there was a very interesting sidelight of that I read. Some folks suggest that maybe tardigrades are from another planet. Isn't that weird? Like an alien? Now, I think the scientific community has pretty much refuted that idea. But where that sprang out of is these organisms have the genes in them to survive these extremely severe conditions of radiation and dehydration, conditions they would not normally encounter on Earth. So you can see where a decent hypothesis may have come from, right? These organisms have genetic material it appears, to deal with the ravages of the environment of space. Why would they have that if at one time perhaps they weren't traveling around space that way? Now, anybody else having connection problems? Now, I think in the end with the tardigrades and the water bears, they showed that, okay, maybe it's just random there, Alexis. They showed that pretty much water bears were of Earth origin, but you can see whether you think those kinds of things, but very bizarre. But the Archean prokaryotes are that way too. Very, very hardy organisms that live in extremely harsh conditions, even now today. Well, diversity and variation that I talked about. Oh, I got to get that picture from that guy. I was out in the woods the other day and saw a garter snake, and there just happened to be a professional photographer along with me. Well, not with me. He was there in the woods. And there was this most beautiful blue-green garter snake I've ever seen. Variation. We talked about variation in garter snakes. That's kind of how I headed off on that tangent. But even early on in the Earth, even early on, as life begins, we begin to diverge. We begin to become diverse. Because very on in the early Earth, with the prokaryotes, they quickly diverged into the two domains that we know today, the domain archaea and bacteria. All right? So we got the beginning there. Now, some of these early prokaryotes were chemoautotrophs, and we're going to talk a little bit more in chapter 27 about how organisms metabolize and how organisms, process energy. I keep wanting to say create energy, but I don't want to violate the laws of thermodynamics. But they process energy. If you think about it on today, it's very easy how that works. Food gets into the ecosystem through photosynthesis because plants do that process, and then things eat the plants, or things eat the things that eat the plants. Everybody's aware of that. But what about before there was photosynthetic critters? What about before there was things that made food? How did organisms survive? So what we mean by organisms being chemoautotrophs are critters that could survive on some of the very basic chemistry when it comes to where they get their energy from. For example, there are some organisms called methanogens, and methanogens do what you see up here at the top. They take carbon dioxide and hydrogen, a lot of that in the early Earth's atmosphere, and they produce methane. And along that way, that releases energy. These are called the methanogens. All right. If you've ever walked through a swamp, these critters still exist in some places today. If you've ever walked through a swamp in the mud, the smell that comes out of the swamp, part of that is a sulfur smell, but some of that is a methane smell. A lot of that is methane that is the waste product of the the prokaryotic organisms that still do that. Some of them can oxidize sulfur. Some can oxidize hydrogen sulfide. Now, I want you to go back to Bio 1 and remember for a second what we mean chemically when we say something's been oxidized. When something's been oxidized, we remove electrons from it. Yes, that's what physically happens. But also remember when something is oxidized, and this is going to go back to your chapter on respiration, actually, when you oxidize something, you also release energy. So the process of oxidation releases energy. The process of reduction stores energy. You might remember that from back in your Bio 1. So if you oxidize sulfur or you oxidize hydrogen sulfide, and by the way, back then there would have been a lot of hydrogen sulfide around, especially around those geothermal vents, because that's a byproduct of volcanic activity. But if you oxidize that stuff, you release that, energy. And just recently, and what I mean by recently is since the discovery of where the Titanic lay, that picture down below is a picture of the Titanic, that this bacterium that you see up here in the upper right, this is a bacterium that is only found on the Titanic. Halomonas titantia, if I remember how it's spelled, something like, I believe that's its scientific name. Halomonas titantia lives on the rusting iron of the Titanic. The Titanic was made out of iron. This is years before they understood the alloy of steel, so it was made out of, for the most part, pure iron. And there are these organisms, Halomonas, who can undergo Fe or iron oxidation. Isn't that incredible? So you got a critter that's actually living on the metal part of a ship that's 2 miles, what's the Titanic, about 2 miles down at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, come on, when you look at something like that and you think about the extreme kind of environment that is, I mean, let alone the temperature, no light, oh my God, the pressure increases 1 atmosphere for every 30 feet at sea level. Pressure is about 16 pounds per square inch. I'm sorry that I'm using English units here, but at sea level we feel about 16 pounds per square inch of pressure on us. That's the column of air pushing on us. But underwater, for every 30 feet, every 10 meters, you increase another 16 pounds. So if the Titanic is 10,000 feet down, about, and we divide that by 30 feet, you would think that somebody like me, I should be able to do that in my head, right? So that's 333 atmospheres. So the pressure on the Titanic is somewhere in the vicinity of 2.5 tons per square inch. 2.5 tons per square inch. You and I, 16 pounds per square inch. So it's kind of like a bowling ball pressing on every square inch of your body. Those in the Titanic are suffering in the vicinity of about 5,000 pounds per square inch, and yet they still survive. So you get the idea, right? Extreme environments. Organisms that survive in extreme environments today probably were able to survive extreme environments back, 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago. Now, chemoautotrophs make their own food. That's the autotroph part. Troph is to feed. And the chemo is they make their own food through chemical processes, through producing methane from carbon dioxide and oxygen, or through the oxidation of any of those 3 materials that you see there. Some prokaryotes, though, would have been photoautotrophs. Now, autotroph, I've already told you what it means. And what does it mean to be a photoautotroph? So you feed yourself using energy from what if you're a photoautotroph? Absolutely. But 2 miles down in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there is no light. So these critters would have been the ones that survived closer to the surface. Now, as a photoautotroph, you're a lot more efficient than a chemoautotroph. So photoautotroph would have been favored, and especially since there's plenty of sunlight, right? Plenty of sunlight out there. Plenty of critters can take advantage of being a photoautotroph. Photoautotroph, someone who's photosynthetic. That's what I'm talking about. Now, do you remember photosynthesis from Bio 1? How many of y'all remember? How many of y'all do you think could? Not enough energy, Brandon. Bioluminescent organisms actually undergo a bacterial reaction in their bioluminescent organs that cause them to glow. But I don't know if I don't think you could get enough light energy from that to drive any sort of photoautotrophic reaction. So, Aaliyah, you remember photosynthesis. My guess is the rest of you do too. Do you remember it being rather complicated or rather simple? Relatively speaking. It's not complicated like calculus. I get it. Yeah? No. Really? You all thought photosynthesis was a pretty simple process? I wish I had you in my Bio 1 class. You just said simple, now you said complex. It is, comparatively. But if you remember all those pumps that were on the membrane and all of those helper particles that moved things across, and how, you know, the water was split and the electrons were excited, and then by the sunlight the protons were dumped inside the thylakoid. If you think of it from a biochemical level, maybe it wasn't difficult to understand. Maybe I should have rephrased my question. But from a biochemical point, that was a pretty complicated, or let's just say fancy process. Would you all agree with me on that? I mean, it's certainly easier than, say, just basically enzyme substrate, enzyme product, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's apply what we learned about parsimony the other day and answer a question. So there are two theories as to how photosynthetic or photoautotrophic organisms became prominent on Earth, because they are on Earth. You look around today and you look at those organisms. Most organisms that you see are plants, and they're photosynthetic, they're photoautotrophs. So we got two competing cladograms. Maybe we could call them cladograms. And as I said, we're going to remember parsimony, or Occam's razor. Occam's razor says the same thing as parsimony. The simplest answer is probably the right one. So I want to see if you guys can help me out with this. So modern day, up here at the top, we've got a variety of organisms that are photosynthetic, and we got organisms that are heterotrophic. The photosynthetic ones are green in this picture. The heterotrophic ones are brown. Now, there's two ways that photosynthesis may have evolved. Number one, first of all, there could have been some ancestral prokaryote that began to branch out. Remember, they did it early on into archaea and bacteria. And then within each of those groups, as they evolved and eventually evolved, outside of the prokaryote range into the plants and all that, various offshoots, various off lineages here developed the ability to be photosynthetic. Okay, so that's one explanation. This would be explanation number one as to how we get so many photosynthetic critters on the planet. Because photosynthesis, once it came on the scene, was much better than chemoautotrophs. You got a lot more energy out of photosynthesis. Now, number two says something a little bit different, but it still explains, or potentially explains, photosynthetic critters. It says that the first critters on the planet were photosynthetic. That this ancestral prokaryote, after the chemoautotrophs, that evolution favored a photoautotrophic individual, this ancestral prokaryote, and then as time went on, it broke up into the different clades and the different family trees, and so what we end up is getting some photosynthetic critters. And what happened in terms of those who aren't photosynthetic, it wasn't that that was the default, being heterotrophic, but they lost the ability to photosynthesize, so now they become heterotrophic. So, Alexis, you stole my thunder there, but I was going to ask you, between those two, looking at them, which one is more parsimonious? Which one seems to make more sense. The one on the left, where this relatively complex process of photosynthesis happened independently many times, or the one on the right, where photosynthesis began, and those organisms that aren't photosynthetic now, in their lineages, they just lost the ability to photosynthesize. Now, we were doing our cladograms the other day. Remember, you can gain and lose characteristics. You want to keep that to a minimum, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So does everybody agree with Alexis here that the simplest explanation is going to be the one on the right-hand side, number 2? Number 2 is more parsimonious, Brandon says. Sean, you're saying on the left. You're saying on the left, number 1 makes more sense. Why does number 1 make more sense, Ali? I'm curious. Yeah, you're saying simplicity's sake says number 2, but number 1 makes more sense. Why is that? How about you, Sean? You're saying number 1 as well. Number 1 would start with someone. That's a good point. Okay, but maybe if you think about, well, okay, but even on the one on the right-hand side, what we're saying is there was some simpler organism before photosynthesis arose. So to your argument, you've got the right idea in the sense that a simpler organism, a chemoautotroph who could live off iron, let's say, would have came on the scene first, and then photosynthesis, that more complex process, would have came later. But after that is what we're talking about. After that, how do we explain, say, the abundance of photosynthetic critters? Is it because many of them developed that ability, that really complex ability, or it's just that some of them lost it? To gain a new way versus them already having them losing along the way. Okay. Yeah, Alexis, so you're saying what I'm saying, right? So you're saying it makes more sense for an organism, or it makes more efficiency for an organism to perhaps lose a complex process than several different organisms to come up with the same complex process. Is that what you're telling me there, Alexis? So on the left, the 5 you're talking about, yeah, that's less parsimonious. You're exactly right. Between these two, the one on the right-hand side is the one that's more probable. This complex process of photosynthesis would have given rise initially, and then would eventually organisms would have lost the ability. See how that parsimony works, right? Tell me about that. Convergent oh, you're saying that the ones that are photosynthetic on the left could have done so through convergent evolution? I'll entertain that thought. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Leah's arguing that perhaps all the photosynthetic critters on the left, what do you got, 5, came about through convergent evolution. What do y'all think? Is that possible? Sure. Sure, absolutely. Is it probable? What do you mean, Patrick? Maybe. Okay. Brandon, what he wrote, I like Brandon wrote, it's possible, less probable, right? So is Aaliyah wrong? Well, based on the evidence that we have, she is. We have the evidence to suggest the other way. But in the absence of that evidence, remember in science, you always keep an open mind. Always. You always entertain the possibility there could be some other way that it happened. So never exclude anything. Yes, what Aaliyah says could very well have been the truth. It could be convergent evolution. Now, with more and more evidence and filling in a little bit more of those blanks that you see there, we know it wasn't convergent evolution. But indeed, she's exactly right. That would be an alternative hypothesis, right? Don't we do that in the scientific method? Observation, maybe more than one hypothesis, and then you go through and you refute them. So good. I'm glad to see you all are thinking along the lines of the scientific method. I'm glad you're not accepting everything that looks in front of you just as exact fact. Is there another explanation? As Brandon points out, there might be one more probable, but never exclude any possible idea. You never know. I mean, some are obviously silly. It did? Okay, good. Good. All right, so now the reason why I've spent so much time talking about the evolution of photosynthesis is because, man, let me tell you what, once these critters started photosynthesizing, it changed the world. Okay, in photosynthesis, what's one of the byproducts that's given off? The byproducts, not a waste product really, but a byproduct of photosynthesis. Sure, right? Now, remember, CO2 is brought in, Aaliyah. Oxygen is given off. That's right. So they make oxygen, okay? And, of course, we all know from our studies in respiration, in whatever chapter that was in Bio 1, I don't recall, but you get a lot more ATP if you aerobically respire, don't you? How many ATPs do you get if you aerobically respire one molecule of glucose? Does anybody remember? It's a range. So if you're remembering it as a range, then it is a range. Somewhere around there, yeah. How many do you get if you do it anaerobically? 2. Absolutely. So let me ask you a question between those two, and you know, no trick to this one, right? Which is more efficient? One glucose gives you 26, 28, 30 ATPs, or one glucose gives you 2? So which one is going to be favored in terms of Mother Nature? Aerobic respiration or anaerobic? Aerobic. Does that mean that anaerobic respiration is impossible? No. There are plenty of organisms around today who are anaerobic respirators, but those organisms aren't dominating the planet. Well, they might be in numbers, actually, but they're not the large, metabolically extensive organisms the way we are. We'll talk a little bit more when we get into the animals about the importance of growing your circulatory system to support a larger organism to circulate more oxygen through. But nonetheless, right away, it's going to be more efficient, if you will, if we're an aerobic respirator. Again, keep in mind that doesn't mean you can't aerobically respire, but you're probably not going to be top dog, right? You're not getting as much energy out of it. But here's back to my start. If you have oxygen in your atmosphere, then you can do respiration. You can do aerobic respiration. So just about this time, as these organisms begin to develop this ability to photosynthesize, they begin to grow in numbers, about 2.7 billion years ago or so. We see these critters like Anabaena and Oscillatoria popping on the scene. Now, Anabaena and Oscillatoria are what we know as cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are sometimes called blue-green algae. They look, Anabaena, you'll see on the scope, actually does look a little bit blue-green. Blue-green algae. Blue-green algae, now this word algae is a little bit confusing. There are many things that are algae. An algae can be a protist. There are protists that are algae. There are plants that are algae, and then there are prokaryotes that are algae. So be very careful with that term algae. But these cyanobacteria produce oxygen, and there were lots of them. All right, that's what I want you to get to understand. There were so many of them, they formed these columns. Down there in the lower right is a picture from, I think, Shark Bay, Australia, if I remember correctly. But those columns with the white and the brown at the top are called stromatolites. And the way stromatolites form are these this bed of cyanobacteria is growing and photosynthesizing and developing and all that sort of stuff, and it's accumulating minerals. And then what happens is that bed of bacteria may die off, and another bed is formed on top of it and on top of it, and these minerals keep building. So you get these large columns, these stromatolites, which represent just these massive amounts of these photosynthetic cyanobacteria. So lots of oxygen is being produced, lots of oxygen. Now, initially, that dissolves in the water, right? It combines with the iron and forms rust, iron oxide. But after a while, so much of that oxygen gets dumped into the water, it gets into excess, and it bubbles out of the atmosphere or diffuses out of the atmosphere, or out of the water and into the atmosphere. Now, atmospheric oxygen right? The thing we've said about oxygen before, it's kind of a double-edged sword. While the oxygen is important for life on this planet, it's also quite deadly. So some of those early prokaryotes were anaerobes. Not only were there anaerobes, they were very strict anaerobes, what we call obligate anaerobes. Obligate anaerobes die in the presence of oxygen. So when this atmospheric oxygen began to rise during this time, a lot of the anaerobic prokaryotes began to die off. It's what I always say, you know, one man's poison is another man's food. So while the environment was changing more conducively to those aerobic respirators, right, by putting oxygen out there and getting their 26 to 28 ATP from a glucose versus 2, there were some critters out there that could not deal with the oxidative properties of oxygen. It rips things apart. Now, there were some prokaryotic organisms that chose a very interesting route to deal with this. They basically escaped the high levels of oxygen by allowing themselves to be engulfed inside of another organism. And we'll talk about that in just a couple of slides. But this is the process of endosymbiosis that I'm going to describe to you. At about 2.2 billion years ago, there was an extremely rapid, dramatic rise in atmospheric oxygen. Now, when oxygen levels increase because of aerobic respiration, critters could now become more complex because they're getting more energy out of the same glucose. So it's about this time at 2.2 billion years ago that we start to see eukaryotic algae. See, up to this point, we're mostly stuck with prokaryotic algae. But with this rise in atmospheric oxygen, switching off of a predominantly anaerobic lifestyle to an aerobic lifestyle, you get these much more elaborate critters, these eukaryotic algae. Eukaryotic algae with chloroplasts. And with chloroplasts, you've got this really efficient photosynthetic organism. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about this endosymbiosis in just a minute, but let's stick with this idea of oxygen and what it did to the Earth. You can see right there on this chart, at about 2.7 billion years ago, the oxygen level, look how quickly it rises. I mean, we're talking on the order of, I don't know, 200 or 300 million years, which is not a long time. And when we're talking about billions of years, call this the oxygen revolution during this time. Oxygen levels spiked, dramatically rose. And like I said, while that was good for the aerobic guys, it wasn't so good for the mother guys. You see, especially those obligate anaerobes like I've been talking about. They were on the run. They were facing extinction. But as I said, some of them came up with this relatively clever way of hiding from the oxygen. But that could only happen, this ability to hide, by the way, when eukaryotic cells developed a certain ability. And the ability that eukaryotic cells developed about this time was the ability to undergo endocytosis. See, about 1.2 to 1.8 billion years ago, is we start to see possible evidence of possible multicellular eukaryotes. Possible. Again, these are soft-bodied critters. Getting ahead of myself, I'm getting so excited. These were soft-bodied critters. They don't fossilize very well. But as these eukaryotic organisms arose on the scene and began to evolve, they began to increase in complexity. They began to develop organelles, parts of the cell that do certain things. Remember, prokaryotes don't have organelles. They have ribosomes and a nucleoid region and chromosomes, but they don't have endoplasmic reticulum. They don't have lysosomes. They don't have all that stuff that we know we find in eukaryotic cells. And then, as I said, what allowed this endosymbiosis thing that I'm going to show you in just a minute was part of the development of eukaryotic cells is the part of the cytoskeleton. Now, if you remember from Bio 1, if you look at the pictures down below, I'm showing you a picture of endocytosis. It's the cytoskeleton of cells that allows them to engulf things, right? So it's the engulfing. Now, remember you learned in Bio 1, that's how they engulf food or engulf chemical messages. Whatever needs to be brought into the cell is brought in through endocytosis. So back then, these organisms would have been undergoing endocytosis to accumulate food, especially that heterotrophic line, right? But especially those heterotrophic lineages that were evolving, they would have had to use engulfing in order to survive. If you couldn't photosynthesize, you had to be able to bring energy or bring food in from somewhere. All right, so here's where we kind of put these two things together. You got this engulfing organism. Let's start in the upper left in this picture. First, we have an ancestral prokaryote. And that ancestral prokaryote, through a series of evolutionary changes, begins to develop the ability to fold in its membranes. All right, you see in the second picture there, the outside membrane is beginning to fold in. Now, remember from Bio 1, the endomembrane system in a cell. It's all connected. The membrane around the nucleus, the membrane around everything, the membranes of the endoplasmic reticulum, all are connected to one another. So back in time, some ancestral prokaryote developed the ability, through some mutation, to begin to fold in on itself. And so not only does that allow that cell to become more efficient, because you remember in Bio 1, you learned that the reason why a cell, a eukaryotic cell, can do so many different things is because it's compartmentalized. You remember learning about peroxisomes? Peroxisomes are deadly to cells. It's an organelle in a cell that could destroy the cell, but because it's packaged, right, in that membrane, it's like, you know, having a tiger in your garage, right? It's, well, a tiger could probably get out of your garage, but still, it's packaged off someplace, so it's kept like a tiger in a zoo, let's say. Maybe that's a better example. Okay, what were these things engulfing? Well, they were engulfing food, okay? But along comes this rise in oxygen. And some of these organisms that were obligate anaerobes would have been taken in by eukaryotic cells through endocytosis. And some of them might have been actually beneficial to the cell that was engulfing them. For example, if we look back in the fossil record down the lower left, that's a fossil proteobacteria. Now, this isn't a microclass, but a proteobacteria has a lot of the same characteristics, structurally and otherwise, as mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria was the organelle in eukaryotes responsible for doing aerobic respiration, right? Anaerobic respiration, remember, happens in the cytoplasm. You got to have the mitochondria for the aerobic respiration. So what if one of these engulfing cells engulfed some aerobic bacterium similar to this old proteobacterium? And then what if in another set of cells, or maybe even the same cell, because, you know, plants have both of these as well, there was a photosynthetic bacterium that was engulfed. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of the semester. And a cell engulfing an aerobic bacterium and or engulfing a photosynthetic bacterium, similar to the green algae you see in the picture up above, would that have conveyed an advantage? Evolutionarily speaking, would that have conveyed an advantage to the cell? Engulfing these two, what may have been at one time free-living bacteria. Why? Why would that have been better? Why would that have been an advantage? Well, actually, with the aerobic bacterium, they would have been taking advantage of the oxygen because the aerobic bacterium would have become the mitochondria. And so now they would have gotten a lot more ATP. So not that. But if you can do anything more efficiently, since the once aerobic thing would die without, but now the use of oxygen. Well, not all engulfing occurred of anaerobic, obligate anaerobes. The proteobacteria that I'm talking about was actually an aerobic bacterium. So it wasn't one of those ones that was trying to run away from the oxygen, but it was one of those ones that was engulfed. Sometimes too, and I'm not exactly up on the current literature on the ideas of this, but sometimes too much of something might be bad too. So these aerobic bacteria might have been exposed to too much oxygen. Being inside the cell might have been able to regulate the amount of oxygen. right? It's like maybe too much of something is bad. It's like when I try and teach my daughter how to drive, I try to remind her that you don't have to mash the gas pedal all the way to the floor. There is a variable speed involved in that, okay? So the advantage would be, of course, that this cell is efficient, right? The cell now that has the photosynthetic bacterium that becomes the chloroplast, what can it do that it couldn't do before? What can you do with chloroplasts that you can't if you don't have them? Would you like to be able to do that? Would you all like to be able to photosynthesize? Yeah, save on your food bill, wouldn't it? All you need is the sun. As long as there's sun and carbon dioxide and water, and there's plenty of that around, man, I'm making food, so that's an advantage. And then, of course, the advantage of having the mitochondria. Brandy, you just hang your arm out the window when you're driving and grab a lunch. You know what I mean? Just hang your arm out the window. Of course, to be photosynthetic, you usually have to be green, so we have to be like Kermit the Frog, so I don't know about that. What about the advantage of having a mitochondria now? What would be the advantage there? Lots and lots and lots of it, right? Same glucose, 30 ATPs versus 2 if you don't have one. There you go. All right. So that's what we mean by the endosymbiotic theory, that something was engulfed, endo, and became a symbiont. Now, a symbiont or a symbiotic relationship in biology, what is a symbiotic relationship? Does anybody know? Alexis, that is a type of symbiotic relationship. A symbiotic relationship is organisms living side by side. So Alexis has got part of that right. She's talking about a specific type of symbiotic relationship that we know as mutualism. Brandon, there you go. Because parasitism is a symbiotic relationship. Predation is a symbiotic relationship. Just because you're being consumed as the prey doesn't mean you're not involved in a relationship, okay? So this endosymbiotic relationship would have been one like Alexis was talking about a few minutes ago. They're helping each other. The engulfed photosynthetic bacterium, the engulfed aerobic bacterium gains an advantage by living inside of the cell, and the cell, of course, gains the advantages that we're talking about. And I don't know if you remember, but from Bio 1, some of the evidence that we have for these things being free living at one time is that mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. There's no other organelle in the cell that has the DNA other than the nucleus, but they have their own DNA, which makes us think that at one time they might have been independent living critters. As a matter of fact, it's kind of an interesting sidelight. The DNA in your mitochondria, only from your mother. Mitochondrial DNA is only maternal. There's no mixing of the two. Oh, poor Darwin. God, the Cambrian explosion caused him so much trouble. Remember, Darwin only understood that evolution worked at one pace. You know from the previous lectures, hope you had a chance to view those ones too, evolution can work at a slow pace, at a relatively fast pace. It can go through gradualism or cladogenesis. Darwin was really only aware of the slower gradualist pace. So what he meant by the Cambrian explosion as being a headache to him and why it caused him so much problem is in a relatively short period of time, a few tens of millions of years, we went from just a few animals, let's see, sponges, cnidarians, a few of the arthropods are around, but just about 525 million years ago, we went from a few animals to a bunch. As a matter of fact, for the most part, all the major groups of animals arose at about this time in a very relatively short period of time. Now, what Darwin didn't understand, because we didn't have quite the sensitivity of instruments back then, was that this really wasn't an explosion. It wasn't an explosion of organisms in terms of diversity. It was a very slow explosion. It had a very long fuse. The Cambrian explosion itself lasted somewhere between 25 and 100 million years. That was something that was difficult for Darwin to be able to discern because of the level of technology at that point. So it looked like him, it happened a lot faster. Now, what was driving all this rapid diversity? Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into animals, but you already know the answer. It's still the environment. But in this particular case, it was an arms race. That was what was changing in the environment. Critters learned how to eat each other. And more importantly, some critters developed jaws. And once you had jaws, man, you could clean house on some of the other critters. Now, let me ask you a question. If you're one of those organisms that didn't develop jaws, and the things that eat you did develop jaws, you're going to be at a disadvantage, correct? Heck yeah, man. Got something out there with teeth and a mouth that can eat me. So that means you're going to be driven towards some way protecting yourself from the predator, either swimming faster, being meaner, bigger, hiding, leaving, going someplace else. You see what I mean by that? How that trickle-down effect works? Organisms develop jaws and it changes everything because there's critters out there that are being eaten and eating other critters. And the critters that are being eaten are evolving to not be eaten anymore. Maybe they're getting really fast. But now, what's the, whoops, almost knocked my glass over. What's the predator got to do now? If the prey gets to be, is really fast and getting away from the predator, what's the predator got to do? If it doesn't want to go extinct. Yeah. And then if the predator gets too good at whooping the butt on the prey, what's the prey got to do? You see what I mean by an arms race, right? Every time you add a new evolutionary trend that protects you, they add a new evolutionary, never stops. And this is the big evolutionary pressure, environmental pressure that occurred during the Cambrian explosion. It was the development of jaws. It was the development of efficient eating things. And nothing like a battle like that to drive evolution, right? Because it's a very acute sense of selection. Organisms that are eating you, once you're eaten, you're dead. It's over with. Coulda, yeah. Poison or make unpalatable. It's one of the ways you can avoid predation. Oh, or be a parasite. Yeah, you could do that one. That's another way to survive. Absolutely. You guys are thinking good, too. All this would have been driven, too, right? But we can't forget about the plants. About this time, or just a little bit afterwards, about 500 million years ago, plants began to move on the land. Now, let me tell you, the land back then wasn't the way the land now. It wasn't nice and great for the growth of all kinds of things. It was a very difficult environment. So plants, when they colonized land, actually colonized land in conjunction with something called mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae, right there. Now, I will talk a little more about mycorrhizae and subsequent when we talk about plants, but let me show you. I'm going to come back to this slide, though. Let me show you. This is the root. This is the root of a plant through a cross section. And all of this on the outside of it is a fungus. Mycorrhizae are a fungus that live around the roots of plants. Now, we haven't talked about fungus yet, but when we do, it'll make more sense. But a fungus increases the efficiency of the plant's ability to extract nutrients from the environment. Funguses do some pre-digestion is what I'm talking about. Funguses begin to break things down in the environment to simpler forms, and then plants can suck that up. Now, the fungus don't do it for the benefit of the plants. They do it for themselves. But the excess is kind of like plants grow and photosynthesize for their own benefit, not to feed us, but the excess is what we eat. Same thing with these fungus. They digest the material in the environment, and now it's easier for plants to absorb it. So now you're talking about plants moving out on the land. Land was a harsh environment, hard scrap living, and then you add these mycorrhizae, which allow the plant to just kind of get a little bit of a foothold because those mycorrhizae allowed them to absorb the nutrients a little bit better. Now, mycorrhizae are so important, and like I said, I'll talk about it again in plants, that 90 to 95% of all species of what we call vascular plants today have mycorrhizae. So most every plant you see around its roots are going to have these mycorrhizae fungus. Soon after the plants moved out on the land came the arthropods, came the insects, came the critters who, kind of like the plants, at least the ones that were living on land, could deal with some of the conditions that you would have to deal with on land. And one of the number one problems that you're going to deal with on land is drying out, right? Desiccation. That's going to be one of the biggest problems. So plants developed waterproof coatings on their leaves, and insects. What did insects develop to deal with desiccation? What part of the insect's body is really good at helping it from drying out? There you go. It's got a chitinous exoskeleton. Perfect, right? So number one big thing moving on land, got to worry about drying out. Now there are other things, but drying out is a big thing. Another good thing about plants moving on land, plants often create opportunities for, I say everything else, for other organisms to colonize. Now again, plants don't do this thinking about the other organisms, but as the plant grows in the soil and absorbs the nutrients and interacts with the soil, many plants actually make the soil more rich, more conducive to growth. Cotton farmers will always tell you that cotton is very bad for soil. Cotton removes a lot of the soil nutrients. Years ago, before we used to use all these fertilizers and all this other artificial stuff, cotton farmers would occasionally cycle their cotton crop with bean plants. Beans and legumes are very good in soil. They put a lot of nutrients into the soil. So you could plant cotton for, I don't know, a couple of years or so. Then you'd plant beans, and then you harvest those. And then that material, the beans would have enriched the soil. Then you can plant cotton again. You can see why they don't do that anymore. How much money do you get off of an acre of beans versus an acre of cotton? My guess is the cotton makes you a lot more money. But plants will do that. They'll actually modify the environment so that other things moving in, sometimes we call plants pioneer species. They move into an area and begin to colonize it, and they make it more conducive for other organisms to survive. But we'll talk more about plants and mycorrhizae a little bit later on. It wasn't all well and good, though, in terms of the evolution of life on Earth. There's been these ups and downs. There's been a number of extinctions that have occurred since 542 million years ago. Mass extinctions, right? 5 huge mass extinctions are identified, and then there's a lot of argument that we're in the middle of a 6th mass extinction caused by good old humans, caused by what we call anthropogenic factors. Anthropogenic factors are things that humans do: habitat destruction, shooting them, eating them. I want to point out 2 extinctions of significance. One was in the Permian, or at the end of the Permian, 250 or so million years ago. And then the other one is at the Cretaceous, about 65.5 million years ago. Let's do the Permian one first. So about 250 million years ago, 245 million years ago, there was a mass extinction, wiped out most all marine species, about a third of all the insects, and it occurred in about 5 million years. So that's pretty doggone fast. Think about what this is saying. This is always amazing to me. If 90% of all the marine species went extinct in the Permian, what we see today in the 245 million years since, which is no short period of time, I admit, but what we see today, the diversity in marine species, now marine species involving more than just fish, folks, what we see today is the 10% that was left over. It's amazing if you think about the diversity there was, right, for 90% of it to be wiped out. What caused all this? Well, the Earth, as you probably know, is not what am I looking for? The Earth moves, the continents move, all right? So let's take a look at this first thing, this disturbance that occurred because of the formation of Pangaea. All right, so remind you again that the Earth is basically a series of plates, thin plates that float on top of a semi-molten mantle underneath, and these plates basically mash into each other and cause earthquakes like the one in Mexico City that you heard about. On Earth, most of the spreading is occurring in the Atlantic. This is where crust is being formed. It's coming up from below. And the Ring of Fire and the trenches, that's where the crust dives back down. That's why sometimes fossils, they say, well, this is the oldest rock on Earth. And you're like, why isn't it from the very beginning? Well, because those rocks have been recycled. They've been recycled down, melted, and then come back up through the, through lava eruptions and that sort of stuff. So these plates are moving into one another. All right, well, let's kind of go backwards in time. This is where they are today. As you can see, the Atlantic's getting wider. Only by a few centimeters, folks. So it's not going to change anything in terms of airfare to Europe anytime soon. But let's go back in time to we're in the Permian, 250 million years ago. This is what the continents looked like. It was one big giant continent called Pangaea. And during this time, what we say is Pangaea formed. Now, we're not saying that continents came together and formed Pangaea. We're saying at this time, out of this ocean planet, these land masses begin to form. And initially, they were a bunch of little tiny islands, little lumps of land, and they begin to grow together and form together, and they form this large Pangaea continent. Now, what did this have to do with marine organisms? When Pangaea formed, so initially it was a bunch of little tiny islands, and they grew together and formed this big continent of Pangaea. Now, it's a misnomer a lot of folks don't realize, but in marine sciences, most critters, most organisms in the ocean aren't found out in the middle of the ocean. There's not a lot out there in terms of a food source. There are some phytoplankton that float in the water to provide some food source, but most of the productivity in an ocean is going to occur on the shoreline. So more shoreline, more productivity, more critters, more diversity. When these islands were all separate, there was a lot of shoreline. Now you can do the simple math on it. When they grew together to form Pangaea, the shoreline was diminished. So when the shoreline was diminished, a lot of those critters that were living in those shoreline environments lost their environment and they would have gone extinct. We also think at this time that the oceans begin to deepen. The oceans deepening and this reduction of the inshore water, or the water around these little islands, would have decreased tremendous amounts of habitat. So a lot of marine species took it in the shorts. That's why 90% of them died off. But I want to point out how it's always fascinating to me. One door closes and another one opens, because here's what happens. When Pangaea formed this continent, what you did is you created diversity of habitats. Inside the continents, it was dry. Out on the edges of the continents, it was wetter, and everything in between. And when you have a diversity of environments, you got a diversity of critters. So the formation of Pangaea might have wiped out 90% of all the marine species and a lot of the insects, but it also created new habitats, especially, giving you a little foreshadowing here, folks, because the Pangaea era ends when the dinosaurs start moving on the scene. So these interior dry areas, desert areas, right, that I kind of circled there, would have been great for critters that can live in dry climates, especially those that had an egg that they could lay and they didn't need water. So they had an amniotic egg. We talked about that the other day, amnion. Am I spelling that right? Yes. What kind of critters do you think I'm talking about with an amniotic egg that can survive drier climates, that could have maybe made use of this new habitat? One man's poison, it's another man's food. Wiping out that marine environment created the desert, which allowed which critters would have done good in desert environments? Reptiles and mammals. Yeah, mammals. Some mammals would have been reptiles. Absolutely, right? Sean, your snake is going to do a lot better in a dry climate. And of course, reptiles, dinosaurs. Absolutely. So you see what I mean? We destroy 90% of all the marine species, but create another habitat. All right. Now, there was another thing that was going on during the Permian extinction that may have led to it, and I've already talked about this. This was volcanic activity. Volcanic activity can be particularly disruptive, especially at this point in history. Throwing up all of that material into the air blocks out the sun, noxious gases, all kinds of nasty things like that. And I want you to understand that when I say volcanic activity, I'm talking about volcanic activity, folks. This is a really cool map. I could only find it in Russian, which kind of makes it cool too. But the blue outline that you see there are known as the Siberian Traps. Now, they're not there now, but what this was, Siberian Traps, T-R-A-P-S. What this was a huge, lake, ocean of lava, kind of what you see in the picture in the upper left. So that's not water in front of those volcanoes. This is just think about a massive pit in the earth. Look, that's about half the size of Russia, for God's sakes. So this massive pit of lava and magma, and all these volcanoes and all these poisonous volcanoes and poisonous gases were going out everywhere. So you see what I mean by the volcanic activity being a little different than what we're used to today, right? We get a volcano erupts and, you know, it wipes out some villages or something like that. We're talking about global volcanic activity, right? Wasn't all bad, though. Made that interior environment. Volcanic activity is periodic, so it goes up and down. So soon after the Permian extinction, these guys came on the scene. The dinosaurs lived in the era right after the Permian that we know as the Mesozoic era, and they dominated, and they diversified, and they ruled the place for 200 million years, about 200 million years, from about 250 million years to about, 65 million years. And they were doing well, and there were flying ones, and there were swimming ones, and there were predators and preys, and big ones and little ones and colorful ones, and all kinds of really cool things of dinosaurs. Because how many kids haven't been fascinated by dinosaurs? Just incredible diversity, right? It all comes to end in one day, though. About 65 million years ago, an asteroid, about the size of Manhattan, by the way, that's a big rock, hit the Earth and destroyed about half all marine species, many of the families of terrestrial plants, many of the families of terrestrial animals, all of the dinosaurs. You know what? I should change that. All dinosaurs except for the birds, since now we're much more comfortable in calling birds dinosaurs. Now, how did they know this? All right, how did they know that this asteroid hit? I'm going to come back to this picture in just a second, but here's where we think it hit. We actually did find a crater off of the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see where it hit. If it hit there now today, boy, we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we, right? The Chicxulub crater. That's not exactly where the continents were at the time, but this thing comes roaring out of space, like I said, about the size of Manhattan, hits the Earth and peels away the Earth's crust, just massive amounts of destruction. We didn't really know what happened to the dinosaurs for many, many, many years, why they went extinct. It was an old joke when I was in graduate school. We said dinosaurs went extinct because they started smoking. Okay, well, that's not what it was. But a brother and a father team from the University of California, Berkeley, known as the Alvarezes, came up with the Alvarez theory. And here's what the Alvarez theory says. Fascinating piece of science. See the red arrow in the rock layer there? It's pointing to that black line. It's not exactly on the black line, but you see that. Now that black line is a line of rock, and of course, as you like Lamarck, you go back in time. That line is from about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs died off, and that thin black line is very heavily concentrated in an element known as iridium. Now, iridium is an element that's very rare on Earth, but no matter where you go all over the Earth, if you dig down all over the Earth, this was a global catastrophe. If you dig down 65 million years, you find this thin layer of iridium, an element that is rare on Earth, common in asteroids. So the Alvarez theory is supported of an asteroid strike because we believe that all that iridium that was dumped all over the Earth, it's a thin layer, but again, all over the Earth, was the iridium concentration when the asteroid blew up when it hit the Earth. So it had to be a pretty good size asteroid. There's other asteroids out there with our name on it. My guess is, I know for certain we'll be hit by an asteroid in the future, but NASA keeps track on that, and right now it doesn't seem like there's anything out there that we have to worry about too much. All right, so after the dinosaurs went extinct, what happened? Oh my God, it's like your parents left home. You know, they went off for the weekend. Let's have a party. So dinosaurs go extinct about right here. after that point, we see these worldwide radiations of species, adaptive radiations, right? Like when the birds flew out to different islands of the archipelago. So the monotremes, group of species, they didn't really do a whole lot, but the marsupials, look at the eutherian mammals, the placental mammals. Look at how, like the trumpet expands. Look at the diversity. So once that environmental pressure of the dinosaurs was gone, because there were already mammals around, even early on in the dinosaurs, but they were pretty much staying to themselves. Real easy to eat a quick little running mammal, so most of the mammals at that time would only come out at night. And the reason why they know this is when they look at the fossil record of fossilized mammals, they have big eye sockets. Big eye sockets means big eyes. That probably means it came out at night. A lot of it had to do with the lack of the giant predators too, Sean. Yeah, absolutely. You could grow bigger at this particular point, right? So these kinds of adaptive radiations occurred all over the world. And then later on, as we move through time, they adapt. These kinds of radiations occurred regionally as well. Like, for example, among these different species of related plants on the Hawaiian Islands from about 5 million years ago. So again, once the dinosaurs are gone, man, I tell you, it's a party. We have this rapid diversification of critters out there. Okay, we got a little bit more to do. Anybody got any questions on that so far? I'm going to talk about a couple of things now that have to do with some what we call evolutionary novelties. Evolutionary adaptations, structures that are fancy, okay? Eyes, feathers, legs. Probably best described by a guy named Stephen Jay Gould. He was an evolutionary biologist, contemporary, recent, and he wrote a rhetorical question: what good is 5% of an eye? In other words, what good is part of an eye? For an eye to work, you got to have the whole thing. What good is part of a feather? For a feather to work, to fly, you got to have the whole thing. What good is part of a leg? You got to have the whole leg for it to be a leg. So evolution would not favor intermittent structures. It wouldn't say, well, we'll give you half an eye now because we know in a few million years the other half is going to develop. Remember, evolution is not goal-oriented. These evolutionary novelties like eyes and feathers and legs, and we'll talk a lot more about feathers and legs. I'll talk a little bit more about eyes here in the next slide. But these are things we call acceptations. And these are structures that evolved for one purpose, but somehow, because the environment ended up conveying an advantage to the organism in another context. All right? Now, just to give you a little bit of a hint, birds evolved feathers not to fly. They evolved them to stay warm. Right? That was the initial evolution. That makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. If you can evolve something to stay warm, birds are warm-blooded critters, that would have been an advantage. So they evolved feathers to stay warm. It was only later on that those feathers allowed them to fly. Matter of fact, the first feathers on the first birds were flightless. They couldn't fly with them. But let's talk about the eye for just a second in terms of this context. Like I said, I'll do feathers and legs a little bit later on. Poor dodos. Poor dodos. Dodos were big flightless birds, just didn't know to stay away from humans. All right, so let's imagine as we go back through evolutionary time. Now, all of these organisms that are listed in the examples there, they're alive and well today, but they represent what would have been evolutionary development of perhaps the eye through time. So we start in the upper left with a limpet. We have limpets in Florida. Limpets are shelled animals. All right, so a limpet doesn't have an eye, but it's got a patch of pigmented cells, photoreceptors. It can tell light, dark and light. Now, if we understand evolution the way we do, that should have conveyed an advantage to the limpet. If the limpet was a prey species, being able to tell a shadow might have been advantageous, right? Now, you might not be able to make out what that shadow is, but on the side of conservative, if you think, and limpets are marine organisms, if you think something is swimming over you that causes a shadow, it might be a predator. Maybe it's not, so you would go into a hiding place. So if we follow what we know about evolution and adaptation and fitness, that would give that organism increased fitness at that time. If you had the ability to detect a shadow, you might be able to hide before the predator comes and gets you. Okay? Now let's take that and advance a little bit further. The slit shell mollusk, still alive today, but what it did is it would take those pigmented eyes and made a cup. So now light could be sensed from different directions. And it can be concentrated. All right. Take that a little bit step further into a nautilus, and you've got the cup, but now you add this fluid-filled cavity, and you narrow the opening. What does narrowing the opening do? You do the same thing. You're in the sun, and you're trying to read something. You squint, don't you? Squinting helps you concentrate the light and the focus in your eye. So the nautilus, which is a mollusk again, would have been able to do that. And now it also has a pigmented layer, a retina. We take with the marine snail and we add a lens to it. And now we can focus that. And then eventually, like you see in the loligo, a squid have an eye like us. They have what we call as a camera eye. A camera eye is we see the world the way it is. It's not shadows. It's not the way insects look through their eyes. It's you see the world exactly the way it is. All along the way, each of these types of eyes, from the very simple pigmented cells to the eye cup, to the pinhole eye, to the primitive and the advanced lens, each of those would have conveyed an advantage. So back to Stephen Jay Gould's question, what good is 5% of an eye? Nothing. But what good is a patch of pigmented cells? Everything, if you can use that to detect a shadow and get away from a predator. Or if you were an organism that maybe swam up at during the day to feed on critters that were at the surface of the water, right, when the sun was up. Might be helpful to know that. Pigmented cells would be able to tell you. You wouldn't have to tell where you're going or be able to make out detail, but you can tell light and dark. That would have conveyed an advantage. Same thing with the legs, same thing with the feathers. All right, we'll talk more about those when we look into it. I've already kind of gave you a hint about the feathers and the more or less, but the legs are the same thing. So you say how birds develop feathers to one near the end of the ground. Danger. Outright be an evolutionary novelty. What's the other? Okay, Sean. It's all sight. It's the acuity of sight. All right. It's going from recognizing a shadow to making out an image with the camera type eye. You see what I mean? So the purpose, it wasn't another purpose like completely different. It is, the feathers was totally something separate, but this is all light reception, right? It's just acuity, sensitivity, resolution of that light. Go all the way from shadows to images to very focused images. Did that answer your question? Eyes may be often just showing your shadows fundamentally being used for to you. Right, exactly. Sure. You remember during the arms race, so absolutely. And there you go. There you go, Sean. Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about it, you could move beyond just telling shadows to telling colors, and then you could introduce breeding behavior in that, if organisms could tell colors, all that sort of stuff, right? Every step along the way. Now, I know I'm running a little bit over time, but I only have one more slide, and this kind of goes back to the very beginning. I'm not concerned with you memorizing the evolution of the horse. Here's what I want you to get out of this. Evolution has no goal, right? There's no set. Look at all the different horse species, the ones that have been through the beginning of time, the beginning of horses. From Hyracotherium at the very bottom 55 million years ago after the dinosaurs to the modern horse today, there's been several different species of horses in between. So guess what there, Aristotle? It's not a ladder, is it? It's a branch. With all of these critters evolving, adapting to their environment, and then some of them dying off if they weren't in the right environment. And what happened is we fast forward to today, we've got one species of horse that's around today, right? The equus. All through all these changes. And it's all about environment. Early horses were browsers. They lived in the forest part. They were shorter animals, and they lived in the forest part, and they fed on browse, on grass. But when the earth became drier, they moved out into open plains where things could see them. So they got bigger and faster, right? And their environment caused them to have to evolve and change. Not only what they fed upon, but of course the predator was out there trying to get hold of them. Any questions on that? I'm sorry I went a few minutes long. I appreciate you guys sticking around with me. That's it for the material for the exam on Monday then, okay? So that's chapter 25, so we've done 21 through 26. What's slide 37? Oh. Slide 37 is just me showing you where we're going to go from here. Yeah, I'm sorry. From here, we'll move our way up through all of the evolution of different life on Earth. It was kind of my, where are we going next slide? No, Okay, folks, any questions for me? Remember, you can use your notes on the exam the last 15 minutes, so make sure you take good notes, not simply just copies of my PowerPoint slides. If they're annotated, that's fine, but not just copies. Just copies of my slides probably wouldn't help you all that much anyway, to be honest. All righty? Folks, if there's nothing else, that's all I have for today. I'll post this recording on Blackboard a little bit later on. If you have any questions, by all means. If not, have a good weekend, and I'll see you Monday.